Today's guest is one of the most legendary sports broadcasters of all time, the voice of boxing, Jim Lampley. So a member of the International Boxing Hall of Fame, he called boxing on HBO for decades, he covered 14 Olympics, and he's the author of a new book, It Happened, A Uniquely Lucky Life in Sports Broadcasting. Enjoy my conversation with Jim Lampley. I just want to talk a little bit about what it was like growing up in the South. So I know you started growing up in North Carolina and then you moved to South Florida, I think Miami. So I just want to know, was the South a monolith at the time in terms of racism and segregation?
I was born in a little town in western North Carolina called Hendersonville, mountain town right at the foothills of the Blue Ridge near a larger town named Asheville. I was the white son of a white war hero father, and my mother was the child of a racist couple in Memphis, Tennessee. Growing up in the South with racist grandparents on both sides, I have no idea via what source or motivation it became important to my mother to teach me anti-racism and to ardently teach me anti-racism from the very beginning. My father died when I was 5 years old, and so she became the dominant voice in my ear. And it was extremely important to her that I not follow the pathway of my grandparents, my cousins, my aunts, my uncles, all the people in the family who spoke in the language of the South at that time and who were in fact racist in their orientation. My mother wanted to push back against that as hard as she could. The result of that was that when I saw Cassius Clay at the Rome Olympics in 1960, he became instantly a hero of mine because it was very clear he was playfully but seriously pushing back against racism, and I loved that, and I bonded with it, and he became my childhood hero at a moment when I was 11 years old. And from that point forward, he was huge to me. He remained huge to me until his death. And anti-racism became a central theme in my life, and it helped to drive everything that ever happened in my television sports career, most particularly my infiltration into and long career in boxing. So that's a capsule version of what happened with regard to racism in the South and my heritage. I was always taught to be apart from it, and I outgrew any vestige of it as I grew older.
I remember reading in your book that you were actually at the first Cassius Clay-Sonny Liston fight in 1964. You were actually there to watch Cassius Clay, later Muhammad Ali, win the world title in 1964 against Liston. So talk to me about what it was like watching Ali live, I guess, an Ali in his prime or just before his prime in 1964.
My mother was a double widow. My father was her second husband to die. She wound up with two sons from two different fathers. She had to find a financial vehicle for raising us. Ultimately, she and I moved together to South Florida, to eventually Miami, partially to get away from my childhood allergies in the mountains of western North Carolina, and eventually, because Cassius Clay was my childhood hero, I wound up saving lawn mowing and car washing money for months in late 1963, early 1964, so that I could purchase a ticket for the heavyweight championship fight at the Miami Beach Convention Center, February 25, 1964, between Cassius Clay and Sonny Liston. At that moment, his name was Cassius Marcellus Clay. It was 2 or 3 days after he knocked out Liston in that fight that he stood on a street corner in Miami and said to a couple of writers, I actually have a new identity now. I am a follower of the Nation of Islam. My new name is Muhammad Ali. That was extremely jarring to me. The notion that my childhood hero would change his name to something as exotic and foreign to my ear as Muhammad Ali It was tough on me. It was tough on my mother. But at the end of the day, it was his right and his privilege to do what he did. And I went forward just as passionately devoted to Muhammad Ali as I had been to Cassius Marcellus Clay. And that was another big educational experience in my genesis as a sports fan.
Wow, that's absolutely amazing. So can I just ask you, so there's a narrative running through the book about Ali. So you mentioned a very touching moment where he actually looked after your daughter in New York during an event. So can you just tell me about how Ali, maybe even after his life in boxing, defined your life? Or how do you see him as a defining figure? Because I remember you have a quote in your book as well from who was it again? It was Mick Jagger. And he actually said that Ali getting older and Ali getting Parkinson's was the end of a lot of people's youth. So could you talk a little bit about the defining arc or the transcendental figure that Ali actually was in your life? And maybe
well, the Ali through line is obviously very important in my life. And it's purely coincidental that as the timeline goes, eventually I went to work for ABC Sports, which was in that period of time the dominant television sports entity in American society. On a night in 1980 when Ali was participating in a natural rite of passage in boxing wherein he fought his former sparring partner for the heavyweight championship he had once owned and which now belonged to the former sparring partner, Larry Holmes. And we all knew in advance, there were probably 15 or 20 of us in a small room at the ABC building in New York watching a closed circuit telecast. And we all knew in advance what the outcome of the fight was going to be because Ali was at that point diminished capacity and Holmes was at his peak. And as Larry was delivering the expected beating to Ali in the late rounds, putting the finishing touches on what would be a one-sided win, I felt a little poke at the bottom of my rib cage and looked over to the person standing next to me, and it was Mick Jagger. I had met him in 1976 at the Olympics in Montreal. We were friends, and at that moment, he said to me, "Lamps, do you know what we're watching?" And I said, "No, Mick, what are we watching?" And he said, "It's the end of our youth." And I have said ever since then, that's the greatest line of boxing commentary I ever heard. That is the most all-encompassing, sum-it-up type line I've ever heard from any boxing fan, observer, commentator. Mick, of course, was quite brilliant and the kind of public figure who could understand exactly what it meant. And he said, we're watching the end of our youth. I never forgot it. And it was a wonderful treasure to be able to put into my book. It was 8 years later, it was 11 years later, 1991, I believe. It was years later when I was the master of ceremonies for the boxing writers annual dinner at Trump's Hotel on 34th Street in New York. And I was the master of ceremonies for an entire evening of awards and presentations to writers and others in the sport. And Ali was there, and my then 8-year-old daughter lived in New York, and I took her to the event with me. And in the middle of the day, I wound up having to go out and run some errands in Manhattan. I needed somebody to watch over her in the green room. As I was leaving the green room to go out and run these errands, I said, "Hey, can somebody entertain, take care of Brooke while I'm gone?" And instantly, Ali put up his hand and said, "Give her to me. I will entertain her and take care of her." And he spent the next hour or so doing magic tricks and card tricks and various entertainments for her while I was out in the streets of Manhattan getting things done. Later that evening, he motioned her up from the audience to the dais to sit next to him during the awards dinner. They developed a natural bond as the result of the whole day. And in the book, I describe how in the darkened cab on the way back to her mother's apartment in uptown Manhattan after that dinner, she turned to me and said, "Dad, who was that guy?" And I said, "Well, that's quite a story, and you'll grow up and you'll learn about him. But tonight, what I'll give you to take to bed is he's the most famous man in the world. And no one can plausibly deny it. There's no legitimate question. I'm not hyperbolic here. He is the most famous man in the world." And she said, "You mean I just spent several hours with the most famous man in the world?" And I said, "Exactly. That's what I'm saying to you. And now he knows you, and now he has an interest in you." And that leads to several years later, when her mother had moved her to London, and I flew to London for her high school graduation at the American School of London in St. John's Wood. And at that graduation ceremony, there were 66 graduates of the American School of London. And the last page in the graduation program was Brooks, because she was the valedictorian. And all of the graduates had been asked to provide a couplet or a verse of poetry to define them. And when you got to the last page, the valedictorian, Brooke Lampley, the poetry line was, "Float like a butterfly, sting like a bee, Muhammad Ali." Update to now, she runs from her cell phone a network of 84 art galleries in all the major capitals around the world: London, Paris, Tokyo, Hong Kong, et cetera, et cetera. She's arguably the most influential art dealer in the world. And if you were to watch my daughter's business style at auctions, at sales, with clients, et cetera, she floats like a butterfly and she stings like a bee. So she never forgot his influence on her. She was the only person I knew who correctly predicted at the 1996 Summer Olympics in Atlanta who was ultimately going to light the Olympic torch. She told me 15 seconds before Ali collected the torch and stepped out from behind a cubicle where he had been hidden. She said, "Dad, it's going to be Muhammad. I can feel it. It has to be Muhammad." She was right. And I think she's always had a kinetic connection to him and to his image, which was tremendously productive in her life and helped her to expect big things from herself. You know, if she could be lucky enough that she's the little girl whom Ali spends a whole day babysitting, how could she not be lucky in other ways as well? And that has indeed turned out to be the case.
Yeah, that's an absolutely amazing story. And I guess he really was a defining figure. I don't think there'll ever be another athlete who had quite the impact he had outside of the ring as well. So that's an amazing story. So thank you for sharing that.
And here's the other amazing connection which ties the two stories together. I was at a party at Mick Jagger's apartment at 135 Central Park West when my second wife, Joanne, was pregnant with Brooke. And Mick's girlfriend, a model named Jerry Hall, accidentally, sort of playfully, not knowing that Joanne was pregnant, kind of punched her in the stomach with a closed fist. It wasn't really a big punch, but it was enough to startle Joanne. She was pregnant with Brooke at the time. So I always tell her that she was touched in childhood by both Muhammad Ali and Mick Jagger. And that doesn't surprise her in any way.
That wasn't in the book. Yeah, wow. Oh my God. I want you to take us back to 1994, and I want you to talk about the Foreman versus Michael Moorer fight. And obviously this gave, your commentary on this and your reaction gave the title, or inspired the title for your memoir, your book. I want you to talk us through what was going through your head at the time, what Foreman was saying to you before the fight, and of course the tactics that he used, and you cleverly articulated the tactics in the book. So I just want you to talk a little bit about what that was like, that moment was like, and what was going on in the build-up.
Well, George was in maybe his second or third year working as the expert commentator on the HBO Sports boxing telecast. I was the blow-by-blow guy and the host of the telecast. We knew each other, but we had not known each other all that well when first we started working together. But then you spend that much time with somebody, you travel with them, you go to meetings with them, et cetera, you're bound to develop a relationship. And the fight was about money. Moorer had beaten Evander Holyfield in an upset to become the heavyweight champion, and he was relatively obscure, not a huge name compared to somebody like Holyfield or Tyson, who was still around, or a couple of others I could name. So he instantly looked for, okay, what is the fight that can make me the most possible money? And oh, by the way, can it possibly be a fight that I'm pretty sure of winning? And the obvious choice was to fight Foreman. Foreman was our expert commentator at HBO, so he still had a big public career going in boxing. He had won a string of fights in his late career comeback and was simultaneously making huge fortunes as a pitchman for various products on TV, big man suits, various other things. Of course, the famous grill, the Foreman grill that everybody had to have. So Moorer wants to make the most possible money he can make on his first title defense. Obviously, the way to do that is to fight Foreman. And oh, by the way, George is 45 years old. No 45-year-old ever had won the heavyweight championship. George is still grinding in his mind and in his gut over his loss to Ali in Zaire 20 years ago. He wanted to avenge that in some way. So he eagerly took the assignment to fight Moorer on November 5, 1994. I didn't believe George had any chance to beat Michael Moorer. And 2 or 3 times on occasions before that fight, when we would be together working for HBO, fighter meetings, production meetings, things of that nature, I would pull George aside and say, George, how in the world are you going to beat Moorer? He's a southpaw. He's a mover. Holyfield couldn't find him, and Holyfield has much better, faster feet than you do. So what exactly is the plan? And every time I asked George that question, handful of times, 4, maybe 5, every time I asked him, George would look at me with that implacable, flat, expressionless smile of his and say, Jim, you watch. There will come a moment late in the fight. He will come and stand in front of me and let me knock him out. Always the same words. He will come and stand in front of me and let me knock him out. Now, if you go back to YouTube, Google, wherever, November 5, 1994, Foreman versus Moorer, 10th round, watch it and see if you can find any better verbal description than that Moorer comes and stands in front of him and more or less lets George knock him out. And that became the biggest upset in heavyweight history, the way I see it. And now I have, 10 seconds or less to figure out what to say about this on the air. And that became, based on my conversations with George, that became, it happened. George Foreman at age 45, 20 years after losing the heavyweight championship to Muhammad Ali in Zaire, has now avenged that defeat and become heavyweight champion again. Something like that. The key words of which are, it happened, it happened. That's what everybody remembers. And that's how that became the title of my book, because it's simple, matter of fact, and can refer to anything that ever happened to me. It all happened.
Yeah.
The whole point is it's unexpected, it's counterintuitive, but it's true. And that was that.
Absolutely incredible. I'm just going to jump in there, and I want to just make an observation. So a lot of the time when people write memoirs, they kind of write it in a way that you get the sense that it was always going to happen. They kind of do this post-hoc rationalization that it was destiny. You didn't do that. You seem surprised that everything happened to you, and you retain this gratitude throughout at every point, several points in the book. I just want you to talk about how come you seem still surprised about how your life panned out, and how come maybe your memoir is a little bit different, that it didn't have to happen that way.
Well, my career as a television sports commentator could not have been more unlikely. I began my network television career at ABC, having been chosen out of a talent hunt. There were 432 candidates in the talent hunt. The network had made clear exactly what it was they were looking for, who it was they were looking for, and I was pretty sure that among the 432 candidates, I was the one who least fit all of the credentials they had identified. They wanted somebody between 18 and 22, college age, in other words. I was 25. They wanted somebody who had never done anything on the air with a camera and a microphone in his hand. I had all sorts of experience. I had already done radio, television shows, hosted them, sports, news, et cetera, I had a lot of experience. All the things they said they weren't looking for, that was who I was. In fact, when the chairman of the communications department at the University of North Carolina told me that he wanted me to go to Birmingham, Alabama to do this interview with ABC Sports, and he told me all about it, I said, Dr. Wallace, this is a failed mission. I don't fit any of the qualifications they're talking about. I don't check any of the boxes. There's no point in me going because they won't have any interest in hiring me. And he said, no, you're wrong. I know what they say about what they're looking for. They just haven't met you yet. Well, as it turned out, he was right. And I wound up getting hired to be the first person ever to stand on the sideline of a football game with a camera and a microphone, utilizing new technology about which ABC Sports had learned at the Munich Olympics in 1972 while trying to cover the massacre of Israeli athletes by Black September terrorists. I wound up spending 3 years on the sideline of college football. It was supposed to be 1 year. I wound up doing a lot of crazy wide world of sports events as my apprenticeship into the business. And then I wound up going to more Olympics than any other American broadcaster, 14 of them, wound up being the host of Wide World of Sports, wound up hosting college football, wound up doing a whole lot of different things at ABC Sports, succeeded Howard Cosell as the host of halftime highlights on Monday Night Football, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It was all unlikely. It was all counterintuitive. It was all stuff that wasn't supposed to happen, but it did happen. Therefore, my call of Foreman were, it happened, became the ideal title for my autobiography. So I was lucky that way. And then fast forward, and Foreman died on March 30, 2 weeks prior to the publication of my book. So his death actually became ancillary promotion for my book, because every article about his death included a line that said, in 2 weeks, Jim Lampley's publishing his autobiography, which is titled It Happened, and that is drawn from his famous call of Foreman's win over Michael Moore to win the heavyweight championship back at 45 years of age. So all these things tied together in bizarre circles of continuity in a life that looks crazy and unpredictable. Actually, everything that happened was supposed to happen. That's the only conclusion you can draw.
Well said. Okay, so we're coming up to time, but I'm going to just, as a last question, I'm going to give you some names, okay? So there could be names of fighters, names of bouts that you called, etc. And I just want you to give me your reaction to them. So there's going to be about 5 or 6 here. So I just want you to tell me what comes into your head when I say the name. And it could be 2 fighters who fought each other. Okay, so Manny Pacquiao and Juan Manuel Marquez.
Manny Pacquiao was a uniquely dynamic fighter who, if you think that my life is unlikely, Pacquiao's multiplies that by about 5. He grew up selling stolen cigarettes on the streets of a place called General Santos City in the Philippines to survive and subsist. And when I first saw him, he was a 122-pound fighter who had been chosen as an out-of-the-crackerjack box opponent for a much more highly regarded fighter named Leishanola Ledwaba on a pay-per-view undercard in Las Vegas. And the instant we went to a fighter meeting with Manny and saw what an amazing personality he was, and then watched his dynamism and his unique power for such a small fighter in the ring, I realized that Manny was going to be a huge figure in the sport. And last summer, I had the privilege of anointing him into the International Boxing Hall of Fame in Canastota, New York. Stood on the dais with him, presented him into the Hall of Fame. An amazing thrill, one of the most unusual personalities and one of the most loving and warm and generous personalities I've ever met.
And Marquez, Juan Manuel Marquez?
Marquez was, first of all, Mexican fighters, according to the stereotype, Mexican fighters are supposed to be attackers, not counterpunchers. A Mexican fighter, by Mexican tradition, does not wait to see what his opponent is going to do. He launches and he attacks.
Julio Cesar
and
Chavez.
Marquez was in a generation of attackers, like Eric Morales, like Marco Antonio Barrera. But he was different. He was, by nature, a counterpuncher, and one of the best counterpunchers of his era, and a power counterpuncher. And when he landed the straight right hand counterpunch against Pacquiao, somewhat predictable, that knocked Manny out, there were people in the arena who thought Manny was dead because the instantaneous power and the effect of that power, the way Manny went down in a heap, completely having lost control of his body and his limbs, et cetera, made everybody think, oh my gosh, did Juan Manuel Marquez actually kill Manny Pacquiao? No, he didn't. It was just a great straight right-hand counterpunch by a great counterpuncher.
Oscar De La Hoya and Mike Tyson.
Well, Oscar De La Hoya was, for a variety of reasons, the most glamorous fighter of his generation. And what I always say about Oscar in terms of his uniqueness is, and I firmly believe this to be true, Oscar sold more individual tickets to woman fans, tickets bought by women for women, than any other athlete. Okay, no other athlete sold as many tickets to women fans, bought by women for women. And the visible evidence of that was one day he defended the title, I think was the welterweight title, against Patrick Charpentier of France in a football stadium in El Paso, Texas. There were 50,000 people at the fight. I watched everybody walk up the road to get into the stadium for the fight, and I guarantee you at least 30,000 of those 50,000 were women. And they came to the fight in groups of 3, 4, et cetera, et cetera. Oscar had unique appeal. Of course, he was a mama's boy. He was physically beautiful. He was a very close friend of mine and remains so to this day. Tyson, the very first live prize fight I ever called at ABC Sports was Mike Tyson versus Jesse Ferguson for the heavyweight title that Tyson was on the way to winning. It was part of a string of knockouts early in Mike's career that led people to believe that he was not only indomitable but invincible, that nobody would ever beat Mike Tyson, that he was going to knock out every fighter he ever faced. And that, of course, wasn't true. That's never true of anybody. That wasn't true of Dempsey. It wasn't true of Liston. It wasn't true of any great puncher ever. Mike was a great puncher, but eventually somebody has your number. And with Mike, it turned out to be Evander Holyfield and then others with counterpunching skill who gave him trouble. And oh, by the way, Mike knew better than anybody that he had no chance against Lennox Lewis, none whatsoever, because he had sparred with Lennox, trained with Lennox, spent a week sleeping in the same room with Lennox, watching old black and white fight films with Lennox when they were 14 years old. And when I went into Mike's dressing room after Lewis knocked him out, Mike looked at me and said, "What did people expect? He's 6'6". I'm 5'10". I've known this since I was 14 years old."
Styles make fights.
Styles make fights. That's exactly right. And Mike Tyson was made to order for Lennox Lewis. They both knew it.
Jim, thank you so much. It was an absolute pleasure.
I enjoyed talking to you. Thanks. Have a great day.